We are now just a few short weeks away from the launch of the 1926 census online. And I think that will be probably the largest public engagement with the past in this country for quite some time. Since the decade of centenaries and the 1916 centenary, especially. And 15 years had passed between the 1911 census and its follow up. 15, to say the least, very dramatic years to live in this country. We don't know what the 1926 census will reveal to us yet. In a previous podcast exploring the 1911 equivalent, we looked at things like protest, suffragettes who deliberately hid from the census adjudicators, arguing that if they were invisible in the eyes of the state at the ballot box, they would make themselves invisible within the census. And we even found the humour in that census, like Tatters Cullen, the family dog, who was included in one return. In Britain, a census was taken in 1921, but of course, that was a time when the very existence of the state was being challenged in Ireland. And in a country where you had an effective boycott of the courts, the police, the general administration, you had the emergence of a counter-state, basically, in large parts of the island. A census was a complete impossibility. It just couldn't be done. But in Britain, some people took the chance they were offered in 1921 to protest. And an article in The Guardian highlights a few examples. David Lloyd George, "Build houses," instructed one man in a large note added to the form. "Lloyd George is hereby requested to bring forth the land fit for heroes. Nation's duty to provide houses." Elsewhere, a man wrote, "Out of work in this land fit for heroes." That was, of course, a post-World War I society. But the 1926 census here should reveal a lot to us about our own transformed society. Some of that would be visible on a very localised level. So demoralised were some of those who'd fought on the losing side of the Civil War. The IRA had to impose a general order on its members forbidding immigration in almost all circumstances. It had very little effect in some parts of the country. And while we don't have the individual returns yet, the hard numbers do reveal a population that had fallen, the effect probably more of emigration than revolution. But of course, in 1926, as we'll get into today, the political atmosphere in this country was still very hot. You had new entries into the scene, like Fianna Fáil, and you had the return of old forces, like Big Jim Larkin. There was a note of gloom in one regional newspaper who bemoaned how the census was collected by the guards. "Somehow," they wrote, "it doesn't seem like a guard's duty, but I suppose our economy demands it. The census in the Free State must be a sorry record of decimation in the ranks of the younger adult population and ghastly statistics of unemployment." And on Fublocht, newspaper of the IRA, it was pointed out that the number of queries to be asked on the census form is 13, and 13 is notoriously an unlucky number. A 14th could be added. Do you favour the partition of Ireland and its inclusion in the British Empire? I wonder if the census will reveal any disgruntled unionists in Dublin's townships or in the border regions, which, that would be really interesting, wouldn't it? Something scrawled on a census return in Rathmines. And I wonder if anti-treaty sentiment might be found in it in other parts of the country. Significantly, a census of the North was taken on the same night, Easter Sunday, 1926, which seemed a very loaded night to me, on which to take a census of Northern Ireland on the cusp of the 10th anniversary of the Rising. The bad news is that an investigation by the Public Record Office Northern Ireland has found no trace of that census. And to quote BBC News, the Department of Culture, Arts and Leisure said the records may have been destroyed during World War II. And as the much missed Eamon Phoenix pointed out, that meant we lost information on the movement of population, Catholics leaving to join the new Irish Free State, or Protestants moving in from the border counties, Cavan, Monaghan and Donegal. But for what was then the Irish Free State, we are now on the cusp of seeing these returns, and I think they are going to be fascinating. There was really a buzz around them in 1926, even in advertisements. Front page ad in the Cork Examiner. When filling up the census form, you are earnestly requested to omit the fact that Thompson's bread is the best. The purpose of the census is to obtain unknown information, not accepted facts. And they weren't the only ones getting into the spirit of the time. So, look, we might not know too much about what's in this census, but it seems a good time to give you an overview of Dublin in 1926. And just as 1911, that census occurred against a backdrop of great political, social, cultural importance, it's good to get a sense of what was happening in Dublin in 26. The city was rebuilding. Some of those who had spent 1911 in the Republican movement were now living in a state that they opposed. Others were on the cusp of taking a new political direction within it. And culturally, the year brought a distinctive Irish radio, amongst other things, into our lives. It was a massive year, as we'll hear, in Irish sports history. We're going on a sweeping journey through 1926 in Dublin today. The National Archives of Ireland tell us Census 1926 is stored in 1,299 boxes containing over 700,000 return sheets. I salute every man and woman behind the digitisation of a pile like that, and we don't have long to wait to see them. Thank you as always to listeners of the podcast, especially those who support it. I've just moved down the road, the final move of my life, I hope, to Rialto, and a house that will be in the 1926 census. So if you see me in the locality, say hello. But for now, enjoy this edition. They say that town is dangerous these days, but even in the earliest days of 1926, the court reports of Irish newspapers would suggest a somewhat abnormal city. The lingering whiff of gunpowder, maybe, and the normality of holding a gun led to plenty of armed raids, normally very young men enjoying their day in the courts. 5 years for the armed hold-up of a bread van driver in Inchicore, the terror of a well-known Dublin captain of industry being robbed at gunpoint in Rathmines. Dublin, readers of The Independent were told in January 1926, has now a special corps of armed police to deal with robberies. It is hoped that the measures taken will be a means of preventing raids of the sort, which have again become prevalent recently. For Colonel Ned Broy, very much still alive in 1926, despite Neil Jordan killing him off in the Michael Collins film, it was hoped that the coming of brighter days, weather-wise, would change things. With the arrival of longer days, a newspaper quoted him as saying, he expected that the activities of the bandits and highwaymen would disappear altogether. Banks were protected by armed Gardaí, but it was shopkeepers who were feeling really fed up. Another term you'd find in the newspapers in 1926, suggesting bored men who'd just come through a revolution, was joyriding. 1926 began with an extraordinary cultural moment. One wonders if it inspired anyone to go out and rob a radio. And whatever about the quality of the broadcast, hearing the voice of Douglas Hyde, Douglas de Hide, a Caint os Gaeilge, was a landmark moment for this country. Fittingly, 2RN came into our lives on New Year's Day.
Tanga and Hinsturige, as Jugno Wardy, agus KB Austin down a gospel air near the Hele, and oversheer the Hele, agus Cow oversheer the Hele, agus Crahasheer Love the Hele, agus agus gun and nail, got Yaku, the man he gave it. The man who gave us mother with a horror, I was the whole way left here.
Newspapers were packed with advertisements for radios. Marconi Limited, what a great name that is for a company selling radios. 18 South William Street invited the curious along. Come tonight at 7:45 and hear the opening programme of the Dublin station, received and amplified by means of the Marconi phone public address system. Many of us, the Herald told their readers, have for months, if not years, anxiously awaited the opening of a broadcasting station in Ireland. And at last our hopes have been realised. Tonight is the official opening night of the Irish Free State's first broadcasting station. The call signal of the Dublin station is 2RN and the wavelength allocated is 392 metres. The transmitting station is situated in the McKee Barracks in the Phoenix Park, and the studio is in Denmark Street. Little Denmark Street, if you're wondering, no longer exists, demolished and now basically under the ILAC Centre. This radio station operated from a small premises with a very tight budget. We were very primitive, but we got there, was how one member of the team recalled it decades later. For many people, the humble crystal radio was the means by which this new station would be heard. And if you're wondering, a crystal radio has been described as a simple radio receiver using only the power of the received radio wave to produce sound, needing no external power supply. The Herald told readers, a crystal set requires no batteries, a child can use one, they last indefinitely, and the upkeep costs nothing. If you could afford a better set, you could pick up on radio from other places. And in the winter of 1925, when this Dublin radio station was testing things out, the Daily Mail in Britain reported one listener in South London heard a violin solo coming through with remarkable power and purity. He thought it was Hamburg, but it was in fact Dublin. This is 2RN, the Dublin Broadcasting Station. That was good, wasn't it? Douglas Hyde told his listenership, our enterprise today marks the beginning not only of a new year, but of a new era, an era in which our nation will take its place amongst the other nations of the world. But for the most part, of course, he spoke in the Irish language. Douglas Dehida was the living embodiment of the Gaelic revival, and there was great hope amongst Irish language campaigners that the radio could be a means of promoting and preserving the language. They gathered all over Dublin to listen together. It's a lovely image, isn't it? In Henry Street, the press reported a large crowd listened to the programme from a loudspeaker installed in a shop window. But around the country, there was widespread displeasure with the quality of the broadcast. Waterford, Galway and Cork, the Indo told readers, all agreed that the reception was not satisfactory. A complete failure is the phrase used by our Cork correspondent. If this week's programming is the best 2RN can do, then heaven help Musical Dublin, complained a letter writer from Terranure on the 5th of January. Seamus Clandillan, the first director of broadcasting at the station, was a really passionate advocate for the Irish language. He was a contemporary of many of the defining figures of modern Irish history, active in the Gaelic League with Patrick Henry Pearse, an acquaintance of James Joyce in university, and Clandillan had spent time in Paris teaching himself French, Italian and even Spanish. So he was very conscious, I think, of language, and he was very conscious of the power of the radio towards language revival. Interestingly, Clandillan and the people around him, they looked directly to the BBC for inspiration. He travelled to London to be trained in this new, exciting medium. But not far from where that crowd on Henry Street gathered around to listen to the first Irish radio broadcast, construction was continuing apace in Dublin. And you couldn't really walk through the centre of Dublin in 1926 without having a feeling that there was something abnormal, something had just happened here. The Independent told their readers, the new GPO will be of much more imposing dimensions than the old building and will house the entire administrative staff of the Department of Posts and Telegraphs, as well as the Central Telegraph Office. The site takes in the whole of the old site and the site of what used to be the Coliseum Theatre, which was destroyed in the Revolution of 1916 also. The front of the building, facing on O'Connell Street, will be the same as that of the old building, with a minor difference. There will now be 2 doors leading into the public office instead of 1 as formerly. If there was excitement around the return of the GPO, which was still a fair while off, other buildings were taking a kicking in the press. The journal Honesty in August 1926 lived up to its name. It had nothing good to say. With the destruction of numerous buildings in 1916 and again in 1922, many Dubliners, anxious for the prestige of their city, hoped to see in the new buildings the beauty and dignity previously lacking. As each successive building arises, however, their hopes are dashed. Dublin has the distinction of being one of the ugliest cities in Europe, except for the remnants of Georgian architecture, which survive like precious relics in some obscure spots. Our buildings, both in city and suburbs, are frankly, in fact almost deliberately, hideous. 2 other prominent buildings, they wrote, Cleary's and the Metropole restaurant, are not offensive because of their conservative austerity, but the remainder of the less important new buildings in the O'Connell Street area are monotonous in their ugliness. Dublin was a city then rebuilding from the ashes of a revolution, and popular in the new landscape of the rebuilt city, picture houses, the cinema, had really exploded in popularity. And people may not have realised it in 1926, but they were right on the cusp of a defining moment. The talkies were just around the corner. They would bring new stars, and they did away with some old ones. But the Corinthian, the Phibsborough Picture House, the Bohemian, they're all advertising stars like Anita Stewart and the great Charlie Chaplin. As well as the cinema, it was a city for dancing. The Herald told their readers, the Charleston is the dance of the year, and the Charleston is the cause of the present boom in dancing. The waltz, the foxtrot, the tango and the one-step are the other dances generally played. And that great journal, Honesty, again, didn't hold back. Dancing did not flourish here for many years because of the prejudices against it as a foreign art, an argument difficult to understand in view of the fact that ballroom dancing is international, in fact, universal among civilized nations. But cranks refused to accept this fact, and hiding their ignorance behind a banner of patriotism, informed young Ireland that those who danced ordinary ballroom measures are damned nationally, if not spiritually. So it was a cinema, mad city, it was a dance hall, mad city, and whatever about the complaints about new buildings, there were other changes to be seen in O'Connell Street, namely who was standing around. The School Attendance Act of 1926 was brought in, meaning that all children would now be obliged to remain in school until they were 14 years of age. And whatever about kids in rural Ireland working in the family farm, say, in the urban centres, that act meant there was a massive drop-off in children in casual labour. Think street trading, for example. And unfortunately, it was children in Dublin and other cities who are far more likely to be punished for going on the mitch and breaking the terms of that act. Unsurprisingly, the issue of housing was never far from the top of the agenda. And when it came to housing, the facts remained really stark. 26,000 households still living in one room. The Irish Statesman Journal reported of a scheme being planned by the Dublin Housing Council to enclose certain little-used streets in the slums and convert them into playgrounds. With the advent of the long days, when the unfortunate slum children are thrown onto the streets for their recreation, a danger to themselves and to the traffic, there's a crying need for such play centres. But Dublin's inner city needed a lot more than playgrounds. And the slums still existed. The fact that they still existed at all, 10 years on from the Rising, was a source of considerable shame in the eyes of many people. And progress, not least in terms of public housing, was much slower than many people would have liked it. The tenements were really thrown into the public mind in 1926, because famously they were put literally centre stage in February when Sean O'Casey's The Plough and the Stars took to the Abbey. Rather than trying to tear down the people who'd gone to the barricades in 1916, I think O'Casey wanted to present them, as Paul O'Brien puts it so well, flesh and blood characters with all the weaknesses and strengths of real people. We got into Sean O'Casey and his work before on the podcast, but the best account of the Plough and the Stars riots, as they were called in the press, are found in the diaries of a man called Joseph Holloway, an architect by profession, but a passionate theatre goer who kept a brilliant diary of everything he went to see in Dublin. His entry for February 8th, the play's opening night, tells us there was electricity in the air, before and behind the curtain, at the Abbey tonight, when Sean O'Casey's play, The Plough and the Stars, was first produced. The theatre was thronged with distinguished people, and before the doors opened, the queue to the pit entrance extended past Old Abbey Street. Not a quarter of them got in. The first night audience, he tells us, stamped the play with their approval in no uncertain way. But Holloway was there over each subsequent night, and the gradual shifting attitude of the crowd was very clear. It was on Thursday, February 11th, that the air in the theatre changed dramatically. The protests that night were significant enough for Holloway to evoke the playboy of the Western world, as William Butler Yeats would too. And for Holloway, it was clear that tonight's protest has made a second playboy out of The Plough and the Stars, and Yeats was in his element at last. It really was a who's who of Republican politics in Dublin that shut down The Plough and the Stars. A young Frank Ryan was there. Dorothy McArdle, a Cumann Civil War veteran and a historian, later the author of The Irish Republic. Dan Breen, but most importantly, those who were bereaved by the Rising. Holloway remembered Dan Breen saying Miss Pearce, Miss Tom Clark and Miss Sheehy Skeffington and others were in the theatre to vindicate the manhood of 1916. Holloway felt that the rough and tussle in the theatre was a bit of a two-way street. He writes that some of the players behaved with uncommon roughness to some ladies who got on the stage and threw two of them into the stalls. One young man thrown from the stage got his side hurt in the piano. The chairs of the orchestra were thrown onto the stage, and the music of the piano fluttered. Some 4 or 5 members of the audience tried to pull down half of the drop curtain. Holloway didn't like the play. He was a real moralist. One of his theatre-going friends was his friend James Montgomery, the state's first film censor. The two of them seemed as interested in knowing what Dublin writers thought about O'Casey's work. They were both unsurprised to find that Oliver St. John Gogarty enjoyed the play. It will give the smug-minded something to think about, said Gogarty. They weren't surprised, given Gogarty's, quote, reputation for filthy limericks, which is very widespread. By Friday, the Abbey had become, in Holloway's words, a detective-lined theatre. None allowed to stand in the passages to make way for the G-men. Holloway's good friend, Montgomery, was busy in 1926, and one journal bemoaned how, at present, 30% of the film output is turned down for exhibition in the Free State. And this contains most of the intelligent films, both American and continental. If our films are to be censored, let us at least have intelligent censorship. Sean O'Casey would depart Ireland for Britain in this most dramatic of years. And in Britain, 1926 was remembered for the general strike, a nationwide sympathetic strike that gripped the neighbouring island. I don't think Arthur Balfour meant it as a compliment when he said, the general strike has taught the working classes more in 4 days than years of talking could ever have done.
Here is the last news bulletin for today. At the High Mass in Westminster Cathedral today, His Eminence Cardinal Bourne made the following declaration. There is no moral justification for a general strike of this character. It is a direct challenge to a lawfully constituted authority and inflicts, without adequate reason, immense discomfort and injury on millions of our fellow countrymen.
And the spirit of going on strike took hold in Dublin too. In June, hotel workers walked out from the Dolphin, the Wicklow and the Central hotels. There was plenty of coverage that year of the Irish unemployed movement, who in September attempted to rush the gates of the workhouse on James's Street. Several of the crowd got inside the gates, the press reported, and the police drew their batons. And the hero of 1913 and one of the heroes of Sean O'Casey, Jim Larkin, was very much back in the press in 1926, talking about the general strike in Britain and the issue of unemployment at home. But if Larkin was still as radical as ever, some of those who'd fought under the plough and the stars were moving in a new political direction in the city. Countess Markievicz, for one. The birth of Fianna Fáil was to prove transformative in Irish political life. The party was formally launched in May at the Liscala Theatre on Princes Street, just off O'Connell Street. And a short walk down the side of Penny's, on the GPO side, you'll find the plaque at the former site of the theatre where Fianna Fáil were formally launched. But in the build-up to that launch in May, branches of this party were emerging right across the city and county, in places as diverse as Rathmines and the then very rural Tallaght. I don't know if it's so much there was something exciting about this new Fianna Fáil party or something very stale about the old Sinn Féin, but many people felt it was finally time for Republicans to go into the Dáil. And the relationship between this new party and the IRA was pretty ambiguous. There were even advertisements for the Liscala Theatre event taken out in An Phoblacht, the IRA's newspaper. De Valera's party certainly hit the ground running. And interestingly, at meetings around the country that year trying to drum up support, De Valera drew on the early released findings of the census. Referring to the census returns, one newspaper said, he said the people did not appear to realise the seriousness of what was happening under their very eyes. From the point of building up the Ireland that the Gaels wished to build up, he told one rural crowd, and the restoration of the culture we wish to restore, the young Irish-speaking girl from Connemara or the Irish-speaking boy from Kerry or Cork or Donegal is worth 5 from the Pale. An interesting line, that. not least for a party that would come to draw so much support from the Dublin working class. The loss of De Valera and those around him from the ranks of Sinn Féin into this new party willing to go into Leinster House left the IRA itself in a really peculiar position. And in the summer of 1926, the IRA launched a campaign of raids against moneylenders in the city, with armed raids on the homes and businesses of moneylenders who had their ledgers and their records confiscated. In Dublin, of course, this led to accusations of anti-Semitism against the organisation, the moneylender and the Jewman being terms that were sometimes used interchangeably in working class Dublin. On Tuesday last, on Footblock reported on the 23rd of July, papers and documents relating to money lending were seized from 34 Exchequer Street, 17 Kildare Street and 109 Lower Gardiner Street. But there were also raids on the houses of moneylenders in the area of Dublin historically known as Little Jerusalem. And the historian Rona McCord has written about these IRA raids, noting a letter to Unfublocked 1 week after the first raids were carried out when Robert Briscoe, well-known Jewish Republican in Dublin, argued, "I, as a member of the Dublin Jewish community, would like to make it quite clear that these raids were not for one moment interpreted by me as an attack on the Jewish community." And Fublock said, "The term moneylender is applied to all people who indulge in the traffic, and the attempts to describe the raids as attacks on Jewry are either the efforts of certain moneylenders to invoke support or of other interests to rouse bitterness between sections of the people." But certainly in the South inner city, that campaign really did raise tensions. Those who enjoyed visiting the city's bookshops may not have realised it just yet, but their reading lives were on the cusp of real change. From an office on 24 Kildare Street, the so-called Committee on Evil Literature was meeting and gathering testimonies for its proposal to the government on the need for a censorship of publications board. I suppose it was kind of a foregone conclusion with a name like the Committee on Evil Literature, and the committee was tasked with reporting to the Dáil whether it was necessary or advisable in the interests of public morality to extend the existing powers of the state to prohibit or restrict the sale and circulation of printed matter. There was lots of interest in the committee in Dublin, and indeed across the country. The Dublin and provincial press are clean, but we have to compete with immortal publications imported into the country. One meeting of the Catholic Truth Society of Ireland was told, "In England, a great deal of degradation and demoralisation has taken place as a result of the influence of filthy publications." And at least initially, the committee seemed most interested in arguing for more censorship of magazines and periodicals that were entering the country. But beyond this talk of politics, a lot of people in the city of 1926 were enjoying the things that we still enjoy. We talked about dancing earlier on, and sport, of course. There was the extraordinary and ambitious undertaking of the first ever live broadcast of a field sports game in Europe, with the All-Ireland hurling semi-final on 2RN radio. Just think about that. In the very same year that the station had been launched, they were broadcasting sports into the homes of people. The game, a clash of Kilkenny and Galway on the 29th of August, is a landmark moment then in Irish broadcasting history. Some in the press worried about the impact of radio on gates and attendance, but they needn't have worried. I think, if anything, the arrival of broadcasting into Irish sport only served to increase interest in the games. And if there was a feel-good story in sports that year, it was the victory of the Kerry men in Croke Park in the Gaelic football All-Ireland. A reminder of how time could heal some of the wounds in this country. In a team that included men from both Civil War traditions. As Thomas Mahon said, during the Civil War, a series of atrocities in Kerry left a legacy of bitterness unrivalled in the rest of Ireland. In the aftermath of the war, the GAA was one of the few institutions that could bring together men from the opposing sides, and in this it played a vital role. I always think what a healing thing it must have been for that All-Ireland to go back from Dublin to a county so scarred by that conflict. For the travelling Kerry fans in Dublin, past divisions had faded away into the glory of a team that would come to share the Team of the Decade status with the Dubs. So the Dublin of 1926 was a city still in some ways emerging from the revolutionary period, both in its built landscape and in the people themselves. The census should give us some great insights into that city, and as exciting as the release of the files will be, it'll be some time before the real digging happens. Thank you so much, as ever, for tuning in to this edition of the Three Castles Burning podcast.